The Beatles played through them. The Rolling Stones played through them. The Kinks, the Animals, the Yardbirds. Every band that defined the British invasion ran through amplifiers hand-wired in 3 converted shops on Dartford Road, Kent. 170 workers, a founder with a £10 war bond, and a half-deaf designer who built the most important guitar amplifier in history because he needed to hear himself play. Then the decisions began. A corporate parent that drained the profits to fund a failed flight recorder. A $1 million deal that sold America to a company that built the amplifiers out of chipboard. A founder sacked with tears running down his face. 7 owners in 25 years, each one stripping something away. The hand wiring, the valves, the speakers, while the British manufacturing, until what remained was a name owned by a Japanese corporation, assembled in Vietnam, marketed on the heritage of a factory that's now a petrol station. This is the story of how Britain's greatest sound was made, betrayed and hollowed out, and of the amplifiers buried under the tarmac where it all began. Chapter 1. The Accordion Hustler. The story begins, as so many stories of British ingenuity do, with almost nothing. A man, a borrowed idea, and £10. Thomas Walter Jennings was born on the 28th of February 1917 in Hackney, East London. Working class. No connections. No inheritance worth mentioning. What he had was a mouth that wouldn't stop and an obsession with the accordion, an instrument that, in the Britain of the 1930s, was as close to popular music as most people ever got. He taught himself to play it well enough to perform, and he talked about it with a fervour that bordered on mania. Those 2 qualities, the playing and the talking, would prove to be the only start-up capital he ever needed. Jennings served briefly with the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers during the war, but was discharged on medical grounds in 1942. He found work instead at the Vickers munitions plant in Crayford, Kent, deep in what the locals called Bomb Alley, that industrial corridor along the eastern Thames where the Luftwaffe came looking for factories and found them night after night. The plant sat squarely in the blast zone. When the sirens went, everyone filed into the shelters and waited. It was in those shelters during raids that Jennings first played music with a fellow Vickers worker named Dick Denny, a guitarist, partially deaf from a perforated eardrum. They couldn't have known it at the time, nobody could, but that friendship, struck up underground while bombs fell on Kent, would produce the most important guitar amplifier in rock history. Jennings also crossed paths with Sidney Ives through ENTSA, the wartime entertainment service. Ives would become his company accountant. The foundations were being laid in bomb shelters and variety shows, and nobody involved had the faintest idea what they were building. By 1944, Jennings was repairing accordions on the side and trading second-hand instruments whenever he could get his hands on them. In 1946, with the war over and nothing much to lose, he opened a shop at 119 Dartford Road, Dartford, Kent. His starting capital was a £10 war bond. £10. Now, what the company became, what it enabled, what it changed, makes that figure almost absurd. But in 1946, it was simply a man with a shop and an accordion and an appetite for selling things. His sales method was extraordinary. John Oram, who later worked for Jennings and became one of Britain's most respected audio engineers, recalled the technique. Jennings would wait outside schools for children to come out, follow them home on his bicycle with an accordion strapped to his back, wait until the child had gone inside, then knock on the door and play. The full performance. Big smile. "Madam, I see you've got a very nice little boy there. How would you like him to be able to play accordion like this?" It was part charm, part ambush, and it worked often enough to keep the lights on. He formally registered Jennings Musical Instruments Limited on the 23rd of May 1949, with capital of £3,000 in £1 shares. His wife, Joan, was listed as co-director. By 1950, he'd opened a retail shop at 100 Charing Cross Road in central London, the heart of the music trade. By 1951, he'd created his first hit product, the Univox, an early electronic keyboard with a built-in valve amplifier. The Vox brand name reportedly grew from this instrument, Latin for voice, a word that would come to mean something rather larger than anyone at 119 Dartford Road could have imagined. Through the early 50s, Jennings expanded along the street like ivy up a wall. Number 115, a former estate agent he christened Unity Works, became the organ production facility around 1953. Number 117, a former fish and chip shop, followed in late 1955. In 1956, he recast the company name as Jennings Musical Industries, inspired, it was said, by the prestige of EMR. The local Dartford press called him the company's Wonder Boy. He had a taste for Jaguars, working methodically through the range, the Mark II, the Mark X, and a personality built on contradictions. He drove constant innovation, repeatedly telling Dick Denny, "We need new noises." Yet he was personally conservative enough to shudder at the mention of beat television programmes, even as he equipped every beat group in Britain. He was a controller by instinct. As Oram later noted, Tom liked to think he was in control of his own domain. And when you're in a corporate structure, with a board of directors, you cannot do just what you want to do. That observation would prove prophetic. But in the 1950s, the domain was still his. 3 shops on Dartford Road, a growing catalogue, a wife on the board, and a half-deaf guitarist waiting in the wings. The Wonder Boy was just getting started. Chapter 2. The Man Who Couldn't Hear. The amplifier that changed the sound of popular music was designed by a man who was losing the ability to hear it. Richard Dick Denny was born on the 20th of February 1921 in Erith, Kent, a few miles from Dartford, in the same Thames-side industrial belt. His father ran a barber shop and expected his son to follow him into the trade. Denny had other ideas. A crystal radio set received as a child sparked an obsession with electronics that, in his own cheerful telling, resulted in the inevitable destruction of the family radio. The war freed him from the unwanted apprenticeship. A perforated eardrum excluded him from military service, sending him instead to the Vickers factory in Crayford, where he met Jennings, and then, in 1952, a collapsed lung nearly killed him. The surgery removed one of his lungs entirely. Here was the paradox that produced the Vox sound. Denny's damaged hearing didn't stop him playing guitar in dance bands. It drove him to build louder amplifiers so he could hear himself play. He needed more volume, more presence, more of the overtones that his impaired ears struggled to catch. After recovering from surgery, he resumed building prototypes. By 1955, he had a 15-watt combo driven by 6 V6 valves. In 1956, he redesigned it using EF, 86, ECC 83, and EL 84 valves, adding a vibrato circuit inspired by Wurlitzer organs. Each iteration got him closer to the sound in his head, or rather, the sound his damaged ears demanded. A colleague brought one of Denny's amplifiers into Jennings's Dartford Road shop. Jennings recognised the work immediately. 2 days later, he turned up at Denny's house to offer him a job. The accordion hustler could smell a product. Denny joined JM1, and in late 1957, the first amplifier bearing the name Vox went into production. That first model, the AC2/30, a modest 3.5-watt practice amp, was a stepping stone. Denny redesigned it quickly, and in January 1958 launched the Vox AC15. 15 watts. EL84 output valves. And, crucially, no negative feedback circuit. This was a deliberate engineering choice, and it made all the difference. Negative feedback cleans up an amplifier's signal, reduces distortion, flattens the frequency response. Most designers considered it essential, and Denny left it out. The result was an amplifier that produced harmonically rich, sweetly singing overdrive when you pushed it hard. The overtones bloomed. The treble shimmered. The sound broke up in a way that felt musical rather than broken. This was the Vox sound, and no competitor could replicate it, because it arose from the specific needs of a half-deaf designer who simply wanted to hear his guitar. Priced at 65 guineas, the AC15 found professional users almost immediately. Guitarist Vic Flick recorded the James Bond theme through one, that iconic twanging riff that opened Dr. No in 1962. But the AC15's most consequential early adopters were the Shadows, Hank Marvin and his bandmates were then the biggest instrumental group in Britain and Cliff Richard's backing band, JM. I provided them with AC-15 twins before Cliff Richard's third season of ATV shows in December 1960. Every aspiring guitarist in Britain wanted the Shadows' sound, and that sound ran through Vox, but Marvin wanted more. He went to Denny directly. I spoke to Dick Denny and asked him if it was possible to make the amps twice as loud. I said, "Can't you put two of these together?" And he said, "It doesn't quite work like that." What happened next is one of the great stories of music technology. Marvin's request was straightforward. He wanted something louder. Tom Jennings' response was immediate and absolute. No, 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 too heavy, too loud, too big. The boss had spoken. The matter was closed. Except Denny ignored him. Quietly, without authorization, he began building prototypes of a doubled-up AC-15 in the research department. At extra parts orders, additional components, unauthorized expenditure. When Jennings discovered the discrepancies through the paperwork, as a controller, he always found the paperwork, a proper row ensued. But Denny stood his ground, and Jennings, for all his fury, recognized that his chief designer might be onto something. He gave Denny permission to build 10 units as a trial. On your head be it. The result was the Vox AC-30. Circuit diagrams dated the 29th of April, 1960. First adverts in spring of that year. 2 Celestion G12 Blue Alnico speakers. 4 EL84 power tubes in cathode-biased Class A configuration. No negative feedback. GZ34 tube rectifier. And from late 1961, the top boost circuit. An extra gain stage with separate treble and bass controls, the circuit diagram dated the 11th of December 1961. But Denny had reverse-engineered the tone circuit from a Gibson GA77 amplifier and made it his own. The AC-30 was, arguably, the most important guitar amplifier ever made. Brian May would later call it a gift from God. It was built in secret, against the explicit orders of the man who owned the company, by a designer who was going deaf. And it was about to collide with the biggest cultural phenomenon of the 20th century. Chapter 3. The Handshake. In January 1963, a Rolls-Royce pulled up outside 100 Charing Cross Road, Jennings' London showroom, and a man with immaculate hair and considerable ambition stepped out. His name was Brian Epstein. He managed a band from Liverpool called the Beatles, and he wanted amplifiers. Epstein didn't want to buy them, he wanted them free. The showroom manager was Reg Clark, JMY's general sales manager, and one of the company's most trusted operators. Epstein's pitch was simple and audacious. The Beatles would hand over their battered, road-worn Vox amplifiers. In exchange, JMY's would give them brand new AC-30s. Even swap. No money changing hands. And in return, Epstein promised that the Beatles would use Vox amplifiers exclusively for every public performance, for as long as he managed them. Tom Jennings initially rejected the idea. Why give away product? Clark saw it differently. He agreed to the deal. It was sealed with a handshake. No formal written contract, no lawyers, no paperwork. As Vox historian Jim Ellier later wrote, it was the biggest promotional score ever, for absolutely free. The arrangement worked like this. Vox provided free amplifiers. We maintained and repaired them and swapped them for newer models regularly. The Beatles used only Vox on stage. I could use Beatles imagery in advertising. Charlie Cobbett, the company's artist liaison, became responsible for getting equipment to bands on time. Dick Denny personally set up equipment at major concerts. The entire operation ran on trust, relationships, and Reg Clark's instinct that a band from Liverpool was worth more than the retail price of a few AC-30s. John Lennon had already purchased his first Vox, a fawn-coloured AC-15 twin, from Hesse's Music in Liverpool on the 27th of July 1962. The receipt survives. George Harrison acquired a Fawn AC-30 with a rear panel top boost unit around the same time. But the Epstein deal formalized what had been organic loyalty into an exclusive partnership. And that partnership was about to go global in a way nobody, not Epstein, not Clark, not Jennings, could have predicted. On the 9th of February 1964, the Beatles appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show. 73 million Americans watched. More than 60% of all television viewers in the United States. The most watched broadcast in American history at that time. John and George played through AC-50 heads with speaker cabinets. Paul used an AC-100 head with a 2x15-inch cabinet. And every teenager in America who saw those amplifiers on that stage, who saw the diamond-patterned Vox grill cloth, the chrome-capped controls, the name on the front, wanted one. They couldn't have one. At the time of that broadcast, Vox had no official US distribution whatsoever. The most famous band in the world was playing through amplifiers that American teenagers simply could not buy. The equipment was a mystery, an object of impossible desire. As one contemporary account put it, America's hopeful young musicians would want Rickenbacker guitars, Ludwig drums, and Vox amps, and Vox was unavailable. The mystique was accidental, and it was devastating. The Beatles' equipment evolved as the crowds grew louder. In 1962 and 1963, it was AC-15AS and AC-30S, John and George on guitar, Paul on the transistorized T60 bass amp, which had a worrying tendency to overheat. By late 1963, J.M. Wayans was providing AC-50 piggyback units and the AC-100 for bass. By 1964, the American tours demanded full AC-100 rigs mounted on chrome swivel trolleys. By 1966, the gear had become hybrid, tube and solid-state prototypes, including the Vox 730 that Harrison favoured for Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's. And then there was the organ. John Lennon played the Vox Continental on stage at Shea Stadium on the 15th of August 1965, before 55,000 screaming fans, playing it with his elbows in a frenzied, grinning performance that damaged the instrument. That Continental, battered and famous, sold at Christie's in 2008 for $182,500. But the Beatles were only the most visible of a constellation. The Rolling Stones, Keith Richards and Brian Jones on AC-30s, Bill Wyman with a custom Vox bass guitar, and Jagger and Richards appearing in a 1965 advertisement with the tagline, "Sound of the Longhairs." The Kinks, Dave Davies creating the distorted tone on You Really Got Me in 1964 by slashing the speaker cone of an Elpico amplifier with a razor blade and wiring the damaged speaker into a Vox AC-30, producing one of the first intentional distortion sounds on a hit record. The Animals, Alan Price playing the Continental organ through an AC-30 on the House of the Rising Sun. The Dave Clark 5. The Yardbirds through the Clapton, Beck and Page eras. The Vox sound was the British invasion sound, and by the mid-1960s it was inescapable. Later generations found their way to Dartford too. Brian May bought 2 second-hand AC-30s for £25 each around 1969, inspired by Rory Gallagher's setup at the Marquee Club. Those amplifiers became the foundation of Queen's guitar sound. The Edge of U2 acquired a 1964 AC-30 with top boost and grey panel that has been used to record every U2 album. Paul Weller of The Jam never deviated from the combination of a Rickenbacker guitar through an AC-30, the setup that defined the mod revival. The amplifier built in secret against the boss's orders had become the sound of a generation. And the tiny works on Dartford Road, 3 converted shops with sheds out back, was somehow producing enough of them to equip half the bands in Britain and all of the ones that mattered. Chapter 4. The Works on Dartford Road. Imagine, for a moment, stepping through the door at 115 Dartford Road on a morning in 1965. You're 16 years old. It's your first day. The JMI Works were never a purpose-built factory. They were 3 adjacent commercial premises. Number 119, Tom Jennings' original shop. Number 115, the former estate agent's rechristened Unity Works. And number 117, the former fish and chip shop, connected into a single contiguous complex, with sheds and workshops spilling out behind. Even at peak production, an internal Royston Group report described JM1 as a small company unlikely to increase the profits of the group substantially. The premises were, by any industrial standard, rough and ready. The amplifier section filled roughly half of building 115. Walk in and the first thing you'd register was the smell. Solder flux, warm from the irons, a sweet metallic tang that got into your clothes and stayed there. Then the sound. Not loud, not the roar of heavy industry, but a constant low-level hum of testing, of valves warming up, of someone down the line playing a few bars through a finished amp to check it sang properly. Testing was done by ear at first. You'd plug in a guitar, play a chord, listen for the bloom. It wasn't until mid-1964 that Heathkit signal generators, multimeters and oscilloscopes arrived. Before that, the quality control was a pair of human ears and the judgment of someone who knew what an AC-30 was supposed to sound like. The hand wiring process was the soul of the operation. Each AC-30 was built on tag strips. Every connecting wire from every electronic component was manually wrapped around a metal terminal and soldered by hand. One worker, one amplifier, one painstaking assembly at a time. The chassis featured a distinctive design, a steel base supporting the power and rectifier tubes, and with a vertical aluminium member holding preamp tubes and the control panel above. Transformers arrived from suppliers, Albion, Woden, Haddon, Radio Spares, and chassis assembly was often subcontracted to firms like Burndept Electronics or Triumph Electronics. But the final preparation happened at Dartford Road, fitting into cabinets, attaching back panels and serial number plates, wiring in speakers and testing. Always testing. 5 workstations made up the guitar assembly area, spread across roughly 10 metres, with the fretting section another 10 metres further on. The guitar production line employed around 10 staff. The broader factory at its peak employed approximately 170 people. And they were overwhelmingly young. And Tony Russell started at age 16 in June 1965, and recalled it vividly. The guitar makers were all young, and like me, all wanted to be rock stars. Russell's account of factory life reads like a memoir from the most improbable workplace in Britain. He was building instruments by day, hand-fretting phantom guitars, assembling soundcasters, filing and polishing and gluing, while rock royalty wandered in and out like neighbours popping round for a cup of tea. Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, being Dartford locals, visited the works regularly to try out the latest equipment. Bill Wyman would come in and, as Russell recalled, sit down next to me at my workstation and share/pinch my sandwiches. I distinctly remember him saying to me one day, "Did your mum make you banana sandwiches today?" Wayne Fontana, Bert Whedon, and the Hollies, the Pretty Things, the Underbangers, they all came through. A 16-year-old factory worker sharing his lunch with the bassist of the Rolling Stones, that was Dartford Road in 1965. Russell also recalled being ordered to build a gold-plated Vox Soundcaster guitar for Prince Charles, complete with an ivory tremolo knob, and being told he'd be fired if he spoke to the press. On a phantom guitar destined for the Stones, he did something quietly rebellious. I cheekily put my initials under the scratch plate on the wood. Those initials may still be there, hidden beneath the pickguard of a guitar that's probably worth more than Russell earned in his first 5 years at JM1. The product range at peak was extraordinary for a works of this size. Amplifiers, the AC4, AC10, AC15, AC30, AC50, AC100, T60. Bass, organs, the Continental, A Continental 2, Jaguar, and console models. Guitars, the Phantom, the Mark VI Teardrop, the Ace, Super Ace, Stroller, Clubman, Consort, Soundcaster. Accessories, volume pedals, the Echo Deluxe, the reverb unit, the tone bender fuzz, the treble booster, microphones, PA columns, all flowing out of 3 converted shops on a suburban Kent high street. And flowing out with the help of some unlikely hands. The Vox Continental organ, That iconic instrument with its orange casing and reverse-colour keyboard required intricate wire looms, bundles of colour-coded cables connecting the electronics. Key contacts and drawbars came from Kimber Allen in Swanley, Kent. Cabinets from Heath Point Timber in Rayleigh, Essex. Volume pedals from Schaller in Germany. But the wire looms themselves were assembled by female psychiatric patients at Stonehouse Hospital, formerly the London Lunatic Asylum, in Dartford. It is a detail that belongs to another age. The improvised, resource-scarce character of British manufacturing in the 1960s, where you used whatever hands were available and didn't think too hard about the optics. Jack Jennings, Tom's brother, kept ledgers of every amplifier shipped from the works, every serial number, every destination, the only complete production record that ever existed. Years later, when researchers and historians came looking for those ledgers, they discovered that Jack had thrown them away. The single most valuable documentary record of the most culturally significant amplifier company in British history, gone. The precise peak production figures, how many AC30s left Dartford Road in 1964, in 1965, in 1966, will now never be known. What we do know is this. In 1962, Dick Denny unveiled the Vox Continental organ at the British Musical Instrument Trade Fair. In the same year, J.M. Wans launched the Phantom guitar, its pentagonal body designed by the Design Centre in London. By mid-1963, the AC50 was in prototype, developed specifically because the Beatles crowds were getting louder and the AC30 couldn't keep up. By 1964, the AC100 followed, built to handle Paul McCartney's bass frequencies at arena volume. And somewhere in between, in a research department across the road, Denny built a fuzz pedal prototype housed in an OXO tin. He showed it to Jennings. Jennings hated the sound, vetoed it. The coming distortion revolution would have to wait, and when it arrived, it would arrive without Vox at the front. Meanwhile, at the Thomas Organ Company in California, an engineer named Brad Plunkett was redesigning the circuitry of the Super Beatle amplifier in 1966. During testing, a potentiometer-based circuit produced an unexpected sound, a vocal, sweeping, crying tone. Guitarist Del Casher heard it from another room and came running. The Vox wah-wah pedal was born from that accident. Jazz trumpeter Clyde McCoy was paid $500 for his endorsement of the first model. It would become one of the most widely used effects in rock history. And it was invented by accident, 3,000 miles from Dartford, by people who'd never set foot on the works floor. Chapter 5. The Summit. By 1966, the Jennings Musical Industries occupied a position in British popular culture that no amplifier company had held before, and none has held since. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, the Animals, the Dave Clark Five, the Yardbirds, the Shadows, every band that mattered played through Vox. The company's products had appeared on the most watched television broadcast in American history. The Continental organ's orange casing and reversed keys were as recognizable as the instruments played through them. In 1967, J.M. Wans received the Queen's Award to Industry, the highest official recognition a British manufacturer could earn. 170 workers, 3 converted shops on a suburban high street, a product line that stretched from practice amps to stadium-filling PA systems. Named individuals, Reg Clark running sales, Charlie Cobbett getting gear to bands, Dick Denny designing circuits, Tom Jennings driving it all forward with that restless, controlling energy, held together by loyalty, proximity, and the simple fact that they were making something the world wanted. But the summit was narrow, and the cracks were already visible to anyone who looked. The works on Dartford Road couldn't keep up. The demand created by the Ed Sullivan broadcast, by the Beatles' world tours, by every teenager in Britain and America who wanted the sound they heard on the radio, that demand was physically impossible to meet from 3 converted shops in Kent. Tom Jennings needed capital. He needed manufacturing capacity. He needed what every British entrepreneur of his generation eventually needed, someone else's money. And someone else's money always comes with someone else's plans. The Royston Industries connection had been formalised as early as January 1963, When The Guardian reported that Royston, a British electronics holding company chaired by Eric Summer, had acquired a controlling interest in JM1. Tom and Joan Jennings' shares were purchased. 368,000 new shares were issued. The deal gave Jennings access to Burndept Electronics' larger factory at West Street Works in Erith, where production expanded from late 1964. It was supposed to be a partnership. Jennings would keep building amplifiers. Royston would provide the infrastructure and the capital to meet global demand. The second deal came in late August 1964 at the British Musical Instrument Industries Trade Fair at the Russell Hotel in London. And I appointed the Thomas Organ Company of California as exclusive US distributor. The initial order was $1 million worth of equipment, with a second stage order of $1.5 million. $1 million. For a company that had started with £10, Dartford Road in 1966 should have been the beginning of something permanent. The quality was there. The demand was there. The cultural moment was there. 170 people were building, by hand, the equipment that defined the sound of the decade. In a work so informal that rock stars wandered in to steal sandwiches, and teenagers hid their initials inside guitars destined for the most famous bands on earth. It was the highest point. The view from the top was extraordinary, and almost nobody inside those walls could see what was coming next. Chapter 6. The $1 Million Mistake. The seeds had been planted before the summit was even reached. The two deals that Tom Jennings struck to save his company, the Royston acquisition and the Thomas Organ distribution agreement, were already hollowing out the enterprise from within. By the time the Queen's Award plaque was mounted on the wall, the damage was irreversible. Start with America. The Thomas Organ Company of California, owned by Warwick Electronics, run by CEO Joe Benaran, had been appointed exclusive US distributor in August 1964, with orders totaling $2.5 million. But JMI couldn't manufacture fast enough. 3 converted shops and 170 workers, however skilled, however devoted, these could not physically produce enough amplifiers to feed the appetite that the Ed Sullivan broadcast had created. The backlog grew. American dealers complained. Thomas Organ's general sales manager for the Vox division, Marv Kaiser, pushed for a solution. And in 1965, Thomas Organ got one. Against Tom Jennings' protests, Royston Industries, the holding company that now controlled JM1, sold the North American manufacturing and licensing rights to Thomas Organ for approximately $1 million. $1 million for the right to build Vox-branded products in the most lucrative music market on earth. The man who'd started with a £10 war bond had just been cut off from the country where his products were most desperately wanted, and the decision wasn't even his to make. Royston owned JMY. Royston made the call. Thomas Organ's California team, led by head of engineering Stan Cutler, immediately began designing their own Vox-branded amplifiers. The Super Beatle, the Royal Guardsman, the Buckingham, the Berkeley. These were solid-state amplifiers, transistorized circuits replacing the valve-driven designs that Denny had spent a decade perfecting. They were mass-produced. They were cheap to build. And they were, by almost every credible account, dreadful. Poorly designed solid-state circuits with no output protection. Fragile construction. Dated driver-transformer output stages, cabinets made of chipboard. Pete Townshend of The Who famously chopped a Super Beatle cabinet in half with a Stratocaster during a performance. When asked about it later, he noted they were made of chipboard. The gesture was theatrical, but the observation was engineering. American teenagers who'd saved up for months to buy Beatles gear, who'd seen those diamond-pattern grill cloths on the Ed Sullivan Show and dreamed of owning one, were getting cheap knockoffs bearing a name that had been earned by hand in Kent. The brand's reputation in its most important market was being poisoned by products that Tom Jennings had never approved, never designed, and couldn't control. As one long-time Vox collector later summarised, that ill-fated deal with Thomas Organs is what killed the original Vox company. Vox had effectively split into 2 brands. UK-made JMY Vox, valve-driven, hand-wired, the real thing. US made Thomas Vox, solid-state, mass-produced, widely derided. And the American market, the one that mattered most. The one with the money and the teenagers and the appetite, was getting the wrong one. But the Thomas organ deal was only half the catastrophe. The other half was happening closer to home, in the boardrooms of Royston Industries. And it had nothing whatsoever to do with music. Chapter 7. The Flight Recorder. That ATA company Royston Industries didn't buy JMY because Eric Summer loved amplifiers. Royston bought JMY because JMRSM made money, and Royston needed money for something else entirely. The Royston Group's real project was the Midas, an aviation flight recorder or possibly a radar tracking transponder. Sources differ on the precise specification, but the intent is clear, being developed by Royston subsidiary Burndept Electronics at their works in Erith, Kent. The Midas was Royston's bid for a defence contract, and it consumed cash with the appetite of a furnace consuming coal. Development costs spiralled. Deadlines slipped. The technology proved more difficult than projected. And the money to keep it alive came from one place, the profits generated by Jennings Musical Industries. The Observer had warned of the danger as early as the 22nd of November 1964, but warnings don't stop boardrooms that have already committed. JMY's earnings were systematically siphoned to fund Midas development. Royston even charged JMY rent for the use of the West Street Works in Erith, the larger factory that was supposed to be the solution to JMY's capacity problems, despite the fact that both JMY and Burndept were subsidiaries of the same holding company. One arm of the group was billing another arm of the group for the privilege of manufacturing products whose profits were being drained by a third arm of the group. The accountancy was baroque. The effect was simple. JMMI was being bled. Meanwhile, the musical landscape itself was shifting. Marshall Amplification, founded in 1962 by Jim Marshall, a drum teacher from Hanwell, West London, had been growing steadily throughout the mid-60s. Marshall's amplifiers were louder, more aggressive, built for the heavier sound that bands like Cream, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and The Who were chasing. The chimey, harmonically rich Vox tone, that sweet Class A overdrive through Alnico speakers, was the sound of 1964. By 1967, music wanted rawer, louder, dirtier. Marshall overtook Vox as the dominant British amplifier brand around that year. And the shift was decisive. The cultural moment that had made Vox essential had passed. Not because the product had deteriorated, but because the music had moved. JMY itself was leaning into solid-state technology, partly by conviction, partly by necessity. Dick Denny, the man who'd built the most celebrated valve amplifier in history, put considerable thought into solid-state designs. The hybrid UL760, produced between 1965 and 1967, paired a solid-state preamp with KT88 tube power stage. The fully solid-state Supreme, Defiant and Conqueror launched in 1967, designed with assistance from Burndept at the Erith Works. JMY's own product catalogue declared, "Taking a bold stride forward, Vox have successfully introduced the silicon transistor to the industry." It read like progress. It was, in part, a response to the reality that hand-wiring valve amplifiers was expensive, slow, and increasingly difficult to sustain when your profits were disappearing into an aviation project you had no stake in. And then, in late September 1967, they sacked him. Chapter 8. Tears on Dartford Road. The local Dartford press reported it on the 29th of September 1967. Tom Jennings had been dismissed as managing director of Jennings Musical Industries. The stated reason was a difference of opinion on domestic policy. The immediate trigger was characteristically petty and characteristically Tom. He'd used company funds, withdrawn by accountant Sidney Ives on the board's instructions, to buy himself a silver Jaguar E-Type, without board approval. The man who'd started with a £10 war bond and worked his way through the Jaguar range had finally reached the E-Type, and it cost him his company. But the Jaguar was the excuse, not the cause. The real conflict was irreconcilable. A founder entrepreneur who'd built something from nothing, who liked to think he was in control of his own domain, versus a corporate parent that saw JMY as nothing more than a revenue stream for an aviation project. The Wonder Boy and the suits. It was never going to end well. John Oram was there when it happened. He was working in the research department across the road from the main works, the small building where he, Dick Denny, and a few others developed new products. Jennings came over. Oram's account, given decades later, but remains the most vivid testimony of the moment. He had tears running down his face and said in words to the effect of, "Those bastards have kicked me out of my own company." Then, almost immediately, the salesman in him reassembled. The man who'd followed school children home on a bicycle with an accordion on his back. The man who'd charmed Brian Epstein's lieutenant into giving away free amplifiers, who'd built a global brand from a chip shop, pivoted on the spot. He said, "I'm going to start again. Dick, will you come with me?" Dick said, "Yes, Gov." He said, "John, will you come with me?" And I said, "Well, yes." "You can become my chief engineer," he said. "Where are we going, Tom?" we asked. He replied, "We're going back to the chip shop in Dartford Road." Back to the chip shop? Back to number 117, at the place where it had all started, give or take a few doors. The accordion hustler, the half-deaf designer, and the apprentice who'd one day be called the father of British EQ, walking back to a converted fish and chip shop on a suburban Kent high street to start again. Jennings didn't have to wait long to see Royston's fate. On the 8th of December 1967, barely 10 weeks after the sacking, official receiver R.N. Langdon was appointed to regulate Royston Industries' affairs. The Midas project had consumed everything. Every pound of profit that J.M. Wasde had generated. Every resource that Burndept could muster. And it had failed. Melody Maker reported the scale of the debt on the 16th of December. The company that had sacked Tom Jennings for buying a Jaguar was itself bankrupt before Christmas. JM1 continued trading in reduced form, as the company displayed products at the Frankfurt Musikmesse in March 1968. But the reality was terminal. JM1 formally ceased trading around late April 1968. Winding up notices appeared in the London Gazette on the 26th of July and the 29th of August. Auctions of remaining stock were held at the West Street Works in Erith in September 1968. Printed catalogues from those auctions survive, inventories of a dead company's last possessions. The works at 115 to 119 Dartford Road reverted to Jennings. He established Jennings Electronic Developments, JED, in November 1967, operating from numbers 117 and 119. Denny and Oram joined him, as promised. An advert reading, "They're back," ran in the trade press in April 1968. The company became Jennings Electronic Industries, JEY, around mid-1969, and produced effects pedals, organs, an early synthesizer called the Bushwhacker. Denny described its sounds, with characteristic understatement, as croaks. And most notably, the AC40, essentially an updated AC30 with 4 EL84 output tubes and 2 Celestion Alnico speakers, rebadged to avoid the trademark Jennings no longer owned. But the magic and the market had moved on. The Vox name belonged to someone else. The cultural moment that had made Dartford Road the centre of the musical universe had passed. JEI dissolved quietly around 1973 to 1975, and Tom Jennings' second act was over. Chapter 9. 7 Owners and a Zombie. What happened to the Vox brand after JMY's collapse is not a story of rescue. It's a story of slow degradation. Each new owner promising revival, each delivering something less than what came before, until the name itself became a kind of shell. Recognisable, marketable, and increasingly disconnected from the thing it had once meant. The succession was rapid and merciless. VSEL, Vox Sound Equipment. Limited Banst was born in June 1968, technically a trading name of Sir Minster Limited, purchasing the West Street works and fittings from the receiver. Cyril Windiate, Tom Jennings' former secretary who'd taken over the running of JM1 after the sacking, became managing director. Reg Clark continued as general sales manager. VSEL had healthy order books, but no capital. The receiver was called in on the 7th of January 1970. 18 months of life. Next came Birch Stolek, Michael Birch of Birch Electronics, and George Stowe of the Stolek Group. Backed by Schroeder Bank, bought the remains. Production moved from Erith to the Birch Stolek factory on the Ponswood Industrial Estate in St Leonards-on-Sea, near Hastings. Under Birch Stolek, the AC30 was critically redesigned using dual-printed circuit boards. Unreliable, poorly received, a betrayal of the hand-wired ethos that had made the amplifier great. The product line shrank. No engineering staff existed for new development. Vox had become, in the words of those who tracked it, yesterday's news. The company folded around late 1972. Dallas Arbiter came next. Dallas Industries, the UK Fender distributor and maker of the Fuzzface pedal, purchasing the brand from Birch Stolek. And here, for a brief, improbable moment, the story brightened. Reg Clark, now working at Dallas, facilitated the deal. It was the second time Clark had saved Vox. Air Dallas received approximately 100 Celestion Alnico Blue speakers in the purchase. Celestion had discontinued them, making the surviving stock irreplaceable. And in 1974, Dallas made a crucial decision. Return the AC30 to original hand-wired tag strip construction. The same care and attention to detail as when JM1s made the AC30. Those 1974 to 1977 Dallas-era AC30s are now among the most prized in the collector market. Better still, Dallas brought Tom Jennings back. In July 1974, at Reg Clark's loyal request, the founder was appointed Managing Director of Vox Sound Limited. The accordion hustler was home, except Dallas had overextended on a new facility in Shoeburyness, Essex, and collapsed in early 1975. Jennings was out again. His third and final departure from the brand he'd created. Rose Morris, and the London-based music retail conglomerate acquired Vox from Dallas Arbiter around 1978. Their motivation was defensive. They'd distributed Marshall amplification throughout the 1970s and feared losing that contract. When Marshall refused to renew in 1980, Rose Morris pivoted to Vox as a backup brand. They had no manufacturing expertise. They subcontracted production and gradually degraded the AC30 with cost-cutting measures. A single printed circuit board replacing the hand-wired internals, the GZ34 rectifier tube eliminated, particle board cabinets replacing marine-grade birch plywood. The 1985 version of the AC30 was a shadow of Denny's original. One assessment put it charitably. All one can say is that these cost-saving measures probably saved the AC30 from extinction. Rose Morris eventually wanted to dump Vox altogether. In 1992, Japanese electronics manufacturer Korg acquired a majority stake in Rose Morris, and with it, the Vox brand. The last AC30 built in the Rose Morris operation was completed on the 30th of July 1992. Korg immediately closed the existing production and contracted Marshall amplification, of all companies, to build AC30s at Marshall's own plant. The resulting models, the AC30TB and AC30TBX, launched in 1994 with 13-ply Baltic birch plywood cabinets and restored 1964 JM1 circuitry. They were widely considered the best standard production AC30 since the JM1's years. There was irony in that. Marshall, the company that had overtaken Vox in the late 60s, was now the one keeping the AC30 alive. Marshall continued building Vox amplifiers until 2003 or 2004, when they reclaimed their production capacity exclusively for Marshall products. These were the last Vox amplifiers manufactured in the United Kingdom. Production moved to China for standard PCB models, Vietnam for the premium hand-wired series, 7 owners in 25 years, from Jennings to VSEL to Birch Stolek to Dallas Arbiter to Rose Morris to Korg. Each transition stripping something away. The hand wiring, the valve rectifier, the Alnico speakers, the birch plywood, the British manufacturing. Until what remained was a name, a diamond pattern grill cloth, and a factory somewhere in Southeast Asia. Chapter 10. The Hair Salon and the Petrol Station. Tom Jennings made one final return to Vox under Dallas in 1974 and was pushed out again within months when the company collapsed. What he did in his final 3 years is almost entirely undocumented. Thomas Walter Jennings died in London in 1978, aged approximately 60 or 61. No specific date of death has been located, no cause of death, no obituary. The founder of one of the most culturally significant brands in rock history has an almost completely undocumented final chapter. His wife Joan had been co-director of the original 1949 company. No information about children or descendants has surfaced in any public record. Dick Denny outlived him by more than 2 decades, dying on the 6th of June 2001, aged 80. He co-authored The Vox Story with Dave Peterson in 1993, the first book-length treatment of the company. And sources note that his son received very little for his invention. The man who designed the most important guitar amplifier in history because he was going deaf and needed to hear himself play. Very little for his invention. Today, Vox is a brand name owned by a Japanese corporation, manufactured in Southeast Asia, and marketed on the heritage of a Dartford factory that no longer exists. The standard AC30C2, the custom series, is made in China using printed circuit board construction. The premium hand-wired series, the AC4HW, the AC15HW, the AC30HW, is made in Vietnam using turret board hand wiring. The Vox marketing describes the hand-wired series as using the painstaking technique of turret board hand wiring, a method requiring a high level of skill and craftsmanship, resulting in wiring that's beautiful in its artistry. The back panels read, "Made in Vietnam." The differences between a 1964 Dartford AC30 and its modern descendants are not trivial. The originals used hand-selected components, hand-wired turret boards, GZ34 tube rectifiers, Celestion Alnico blue speakers, and marine-grade birch plywood cabinets. The modern Chinese models use printed circuit boards, solid-state rectifiers, Celestion greenback speakers, and MDF or particle board on budget versions. An amp technician's verdict shared on a forum: in general, not as good due to cheaper components. They use very cheap resistors, capacitors and transformers. The result is cheesy sound. Others disagree. The same designer, Steve Grindrod, worked on both the UK and Chinese models, and many players report satisfaction with what Korg produces. The Vietnamese hand-wired models split the difference. Turret board construction and tube rectifiers, but modern commercial-grade components and no Celestion blues. The collector market renders its own judgment. Original 1960s JMY, AC30s command £2,500 to £6,000 or more, depending on condition and specification. The Korg era UK-built models from the Marshall period fetch £1,500 to £2,500 and are rising. And the Vietnamese hand-wired models do not command a significant premium over the Chinese PCB versions on the secondary market. A verdict from the marketplace on the perceived value of offshore hand wiring that no amount of marketing copy about beautiful artistry can quite overcome. Perhaps the deepest irony belongs to the JMI name itself. In 1997, Richard and Justin Harrison, of Highwatt UK, purchased the JM1 trademark and now produce period-correct, hand-wired, UK-built A. C30 replicas under the JMY brand. Their website carries a disclaimer: JMI amplification are in no way affiliated with Vox amplification, Korg. The spiritual successor to the Dartford craftspeople cannot legally use the name Vox. The name Vox cannot legally be applied to amplifiers built in Britain by people carrying on the original tradition. Each owns half of a heritage that only makes sense whole. On the 14th of February 2017, a blue plaque was unveiled at 119 Dartford Road. About 100 people attended. Dick Denny's son Richard, his granddaughter Emily Turner, Dartford Council leader Jeremy Kite, Korg UK Managing Director Rob Castle, and approximately 20 former Vox factory workers. The plaque reads, "From these premises, music entrepreneur Tom Jennings and sound engineer Dick Denny produced the first Vox amplifier, changing the sound of popular music forever." It was initiated by vintage guitar collector Stuart Leach, who approached Dartford Borough Council. The plaque hangs on the wall between a hair salon called Hair Flair and a business centre. Number 119, the original shop, the chip shop, as the place where Jennings started with £10 and Denny built his prototypes, is the only surviving original building. Number 115, Unity Works, the main factory floor where Tony Russell built guitars and Bill Wyman stole sandwiches, was demolished. An Esso petrol station and a Tesco Express stand in its place, and beneath that petrol station forecourt, according to those who remember, lie the remains. When defective or unsaleable amplifiers accumulated in the sheds behind the factory, and a hole was being dug at a nearby construction site, the surplus stock was buried there. The rotting remains of dozens of the most historically significant Vox amplifiers ever made, hand-wired, valve-driven, built by teenagers on Dartford Road, are said to lie under the tarmac, where people now fill their cars with petrol. And Dartford itself tells the wider story. The town that produced Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, both born at Livingston Hospital, both raised streets apart, reunited by chance on Platform 2. Of Dartford Railway Station on the 17th of October 1961, when Richards spotted Jagger carrying Chuck Berry and Muddy Waters records ordered directly from Chess Records in Chicago. Also produced the amplifiers that they and virtually every British invasion band played through. Far Out magazine once described Dartford as possessing an utterly unremarkable suburban character. Its only other claim to fame is the Dartford Crossing Bridge. The town has since tried to honour its musical heritage. A blue plaque at Platform 2, bronze statues of the Glimmer Twins at One Bell Corner, 13 commemorative street names including Satisfaction Street and Ruby Tuesday Drive, and the Mick Jagger Centre at his former school, which he still finances through the Red Rooster programme, giving 450 pupils a year access to instruments. A former Vox worker, commenting on a Shadows music forum years later, captured the broader trajectory with the precision of someone who'd lived it. That about sums up the UK at this time. We used to build anything better than most. Most factories are now shops. Where I live, the Brooklands estate, which was Vickers building great aircraft going back to before the war, is now Tesco, Argos, selling goods from abroad. We were once a great country making goods of all sorts and selling them to the world. And now Vox is made in China. Chapter 11. What the Sound Remembers. The Vox AC30 is one of perhaps 5 or 6 pieces of technology that physically shaped the sound of popular music in the 20th century. It sits alongside the Fender Stratocaster, the Gibson Les Paul, the Marshall JCM 800, the Moog synthesizer, and the Shure SM58. Instruments and machines without which the music of the last 70 years would sound fundamentally different. It was designed by a partially deaf man in a shed behind a former fish and chip shop in Dartford, Kent. Built in secret, against the explicit orders of the man who owned the company. Made famous by the Shadows, then made immortal by the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Kinks and every band that followed them through the door. Yet the company that created it was destroyed not by competition or obsolescence, but by a holding company that drained its profits to build a flight recorder that never flew. Its founder was sacked with tears on his face, died in obscurity 3 years later, and left no obituary. Its chief designer received very little for his invention. Its factory is a petrol station. Its brand is owned by a corporation in Tokyo. Its products are assembled by workers in Hanoi and Shenzhen, whose names we do not know and who have never stood on Dartford Road, and who have never smelled solder flux in a converted shop while a Rolling Stone ate their sandwiches. And yet the sound survives. That chimey, harmonically rich, as sweetly overdriven Class A bloom through. Celestion Blue. Alnico speakers, the sound that a half-deaf man chased because he needed to hear himself play. It survives in every recording Brian May ever made with those £25 second-hand amps. In every U2 album filtered through the Edge's 1964 grey panel. In every pub band and bedroom guitarist who plugs into an AC30 and hears for the first time the way the notes open up when you push the volume past the point of politeness. The sound outlived the company. It outlived the factory. It outlived the man who built both. What it cannot do, what no sound can do, is bring back the world that made it. The teenagers building guitars while rock stars wandered in off a suburban high street. The half-deaf designer soldering late into the evening in a shed behind a chip shop. And the accordion hustler on his bicycle, knocking on doors, smiling that big smile, convinced that the next sale was the one that would change everything. He was right about that in the end. One of them did.